Life in the 1950s, a trip down memory lane. Whether you experienced and were living in the 1950s or are just curious, Life in the 1950s, a trip down memory lane will give you insight into some of the events, fads, and lifestyles that marked that decade. With World War II ending a few years before, there was a renewed spirit of hope and economic expansion in the 1950s. The decade has been referred to as the Golden Age, and baby boomers were arriving on the scene. By 1952 inflation had receded, and the United States was a major influential economic power. War. The Korean War started on June 25, 1950. The Korean War started between North, backed by Russia, and South Korea, pro-Western Republic. Soon forces from the United States became involved on South Korea's behalf, and officials saw it as a war against communism. The Korean War ended, and the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on June 27, 1953. This drew a new border between North Korea and South Korea, granting South Korea some additional territory and demilitarizing the zone between the two. Another defining element of the 1950s was the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. Though military action never occurred, there was hostility between the two nations. Rosa Parks. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks took her usual bus trip on her way home from work. She decided to take a sit down and then refused to relinquish the seat to a white passenger. She disobeyed a law in Alabama that required African Americans to give up their seats to white people when the bus was full, which led to her arrest for civil disobedience. Her arrest led to the boycott of the Montgomery bus system for 381 days. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation on public transportation. Many say that Rosa Parks was the figure behind the 1960s civil rights movement. Medical, polio, a significant medical finding by Jonas Salk eradicated much of the crippling disease, polio, in the United States by way of vaccination. Mass inoculation of school children started in 1954. By 1955 more than 4 million doses of the vaccine were given, and the drop in polio was substantial. Science. In 1957 the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. This was the first satellite to orbit the Earth. The space race had begun between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was during this time, in 1958, that NASA was founded. Two new states. In 1959, an exciting time in American history when two new states were added to the United States. Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states. Automobiles. There were quite a few innovations that became more popular and standard in the automobile of the 1950s. Four of the major ones are automatic transmissions, power-assisted steering, power windows, and seat belts. The average price of a car in 1950 was $1,510, and at the end of the decade, the average price had climbed to $2,200. Fashion. The popular dresses of the 1950s were cinched at the waist and flared out to right above the knee. Known as swing dresses, petticoats were worn underneath to give fullness. Pencil and poodle skirts were very popular, especially among young women. When thinking about the 1950s and men's fashion, one of the first images might be of leather jackets like that worn by Fonzie in the popular TV show Happy Days. And though that was the fashion, many young men wore suits, and they were still worn by men and especially in the office. Probably no shoe of the 1950s is as iconic as the black and white saddle shoe. Worn with bobby socks and a poodle skirt was a very popular trend for teens and women. Penny loafers were also popular for men and began replacing lace-up dress shoes. Hairstyles. One of the most popular hairstyles for men was the pompadour. The pompadour became even more popular when worn by stars such as Elvis and James Dean. Men also wore their hair short with a side part, and crew cuts were also popular. Popular haircuts for American women included the poodle cut worn by such actresses as Lucille Ball and Connie Stevens. Other popular women's hairstyles in the 1950s include the classic ponytail, bouffant, soft bob, and pixie cut. Entertainment. Popular dances: bomba, bunny hop, Hully Gully, Madison, sock hop, the hand jive, the jitterbug, the stroll, and the twist. Music. The 1950s ushered in rock and roll, a type of music to American culture. Artists like Elvis Presley, Ricky Nelson, Chuck Berry, and the list goes on and on had emerged. Television. The 1950s has been described as the golden age of television. By 1959, 85.9% of households had a TV. Movies. The motion picture industry faced its first existential threat in the 1950s with television. However, larger-than-life stars still lit up the screens in movie theaters and drive-in movies. Some of the biggest names, though not all, in the movies of that era are Burt Lancaster, Charlton Heston, Danny Kaye, Dean Martin, Debbie Reynolds, Doris Day, Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra, Grace Kelly, Humphrey Bogart, James Dean, James Stewart, Marilyn Monroe, Marlon Brando, Natalie Wood, and Rock Hudson. Some of the more popular movies of the 1950s are All About Eve, Cinderella, Sunset Boulevard, A Place in the Sun, A Streetcar Named Desire, High Noon, Singin' in the Rain, From Here to Eternity, Godzilla, Rebel Without a Cause, The Ten Commandments, 12 Angry Men, Ben-Hur, and Some Like It Hot. Fads. Panty Raid, a prank where large groups of college men would invade female dorms and steal their panties. Phone booth cramming, a fad where several young people would enter a phone booth until no more could fit in. The record was set on March 20, 1959, in South Africa, where 25 people were able to squeeze in. Games/toys. Popular games originating in the 1950s include Perkwacky, Risk, and Yahtzee. Some of the most popular toys that made their way onto the scene in the 1950s were beanies with propellers, Matchbox cars, Hula Hoopry CXGDD Pusos Barbie. Conclusion. In looking back at life in the 1950s, a trip down memory lane, I hope you were able to revisit some fond life events. If you didn't live during that time, my hope is you were able to learn something new about the decade. To read the full article, go to https://livingyourSeniorLife.com/life in the 1950s/. Thank you for watching. livingyourSeniorLife.com